the book of Isaiah, and you can see here that in chapters there. Let me start right here. There are two parts here. The first Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, and then there's the second Isaiah, which is chapters 40 through 66. Now, when looking at the commentaries, they tend to, there's a couple modes of thought here, okay? And the idea is that Isaiah is divided in two. There were, Isaiah only wrote chapters 1 through 39. The remainder, 40 through 66, were added in by a redactor, okay? And the reason they say this is because when you look at chapters 1 through 39, these are the events that happened during Isaiah's life. Okay? When you look at chapters 40 through 66, these are prophetic. Okay, so these modern scholars who look at the book of Isaiah and they come up with these theories, they don't believe in prophetic word from God, that Isaiah could have known from God that these events would happen, because the events that are described in chapters 40 through 66 are exactly what happened to Israel. And so they believe that these things had to have been written later and then added in. And to me that seems like that's quite deceptive. That I don't believe that is the way the book of Isaiah is all about. I believe that God prophetically spoke through Isaiah of what was going to happen, and that these are all of Isaiah's words. In fact, when we read verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 1, it indicates that Isaiah is the author of the entire book, okay, of Isaiah. And this isn't some trickery, that's going on here in the compilation of Isaiah by later redactors, and it just, that to me that's inconsistent with the power of God in Isaiah's life and in our lives today. Now, in this kind of map of Isaiah, you can see in chapters 1 through 5, it's a kind of a preface and a summary. And then in chapter 6, there is a call for service. So when reading the commentaries on Isaiah, there's a lot of discussion that goes on whether chapters 1 through 5 should be before chapter 6 or chapter 6 should be before 1 through 5, and there are issues here, because it seems like he goes all the way through chapter 5, and then in 6 you see Isaiah is called, and the issue is that chapter 6 is closely coupled to chapter 7. You can't exactly stick chapter 1 through 5 between chapter 6 and 7. It doesn't work that way. So he had to have written 1 through 5 prior to 6. It's just the way it is. But we see here that Isaiah's call to serve was in chapter 6, and then the warning to King Ahaz in chapter 7. Isaiah gives a warning to Israel in chapter 8 through 12, a warning to the nations surrounding Israel in chapters 13 to 23, and then Isaiah's apocalypse in chapter 24 to 27, and then the 7 woes in chapter 28 to 35, and then the deliverance through a righteous king in chapter 36 to 39. And then when we hop over to chapter 40, we get the magnificence of God. And then 41 to 45, he speaks about the servants of God. And then 46 to 47, there's words on the prophetic power. Okay, and then 48 to 52, covenants of Israel, with Israel. 53 to 55, come unto the Messiah, unto Christ, right? And then 56 to 62, the birth of Zion. And 63 to 66 is the redemption and judgment. Now, I want to note that there are 4 songs in here Isaiah has in his book. And so it's chapter 42, 49, 50, and then, let's see, 50, make that 0 look like a 0, okay. And then it is 50, 52 through 53. Okay, so those are grouped together. So there are four songs here. And I've been told by Orthodox Jews, a friend of mine, online that said that Isaiah 53 is a part of one of 4 songs and not a prophetic of the Messiah, Yeshua, right? And so we will look at this. I never really looked at this. We will look at this. We'll try and look at this when we get there. And it'll be a number of years. But that is something we'll definitely want to look at. And so that's kind of an overview, a high level overview of Isaiah. So when we look at the timeline on Isaiah, the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, his ministry was active during the time period of 740 BC to 701 BC. You know, his name Yeshayahu, right? It means God is salvation. His name alludes to the major teachings Isaiah will be teaching the people, right? The Lord God, He is salvation, right? He is their salvation. And Isaiah lived in Jerusalem, and he referred to his wife as the prophetess, giving his 2 sons the names Shir Jashub, meaning a remnant will return, and Maher Shalal Habaz, meaning he has made haste to the plunder. And so these names were given to be symbolic of his prophecies. The first was intended for Israel to return to the faith in God and the God of Israel. And the second was possibly intended as a warning to Pekah, the person put in place as king of Israel, and Rezin, the king of Aram from Syria. They besieged Jerusalem in 734 BC, and in an attempt to dispose of King Ahaz, who refused to join them in their alliance against Assyria. So Isaiah was called to prophesy in the year of King Uzziah's death in 740 BC, which came as a vision in the temple. Now, the historical setting of the book of Isaiah provides us with the background for his message, and this is essential for understanding his message. And the uniqueness of Isaiah's book is that it covers a wide range or wide span of Israel's history beyond the ministry of Isaiah from 740 to 701. Remember that when you're in BC, right before the Common Era, right, you're counting backwards. So 740 was older than 701. 701 is closer to 0 BC, right? And so the reason that the uniqueness of Isaiah's book is so significant is that Isaiah 1 through 39 describes the events that took place during Isaiah's lifetime. Isaiah 40 through 66 describe these future events, and because of this, multiple theories have been raised. As I mentioned earlier, is Isaiah being written by multiple authors. There are 3 historical settings. One is the period of Isaiah's lifetime between 740 and 701 BC. That's Isaiah 1 through 39. The second is the period of the exile. That's 605 to 539, and that's Isaiah 40 through chapter 55. And the third period is the period of return, and that was from 539 to 500 BC, and that was Isaiah chapter 56 to 66. So because of this widespread timeline based on the prophetic message that we receive in the second part of Isaiah, chapter 40 through 66, there are many perplexing theories that come by scholars today. And like I had mentioned, I believe that the reason they say that there were multiple authors and other redactors coming in is because they lack faith. They lack faith in the power of God to prophetically speak through Isaiah, right? And I believe that God spoke through Isaiah all of these things, and he wrote them down. Now, when reading through Isaiah at the Hebrew text, at the Hebrew level, it doesn't really seem to be much of a difference linguistically. I mean, I'm no expert, right? But to me, there didn't seem to be much of a difference. All of Isaiah is very difficult to read. It is, when reading through the Hebrew Bible, and I try to do this every year through the Hebrew Bible once, okay? And you can read through Torah easily. I can read through Joshua, I can read through Judges, I can read through the Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel, right, and the Kings. So easy. You hit Isaiah and it's like, bam, that is hard. What the heck? What happened here? Isaiah is difficult. In the other books, you got Jeremiah and Ezekiel and stuff like that follow him. They're not as hard. You hit Job. Now Job, that's a hard one too. But Isaiah is tough. So it's really tough. And that makes it even harder to dig into. So I'll try and do the best that I can. But now, based upon, back to what I wrote here, because I kind of diverged. But based upon Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1, it appears that everything that is written is from Isaiah, the son of Amos, right? And note that Isaiah 2, verse 1, 7, verse 3, 13, verse 1, 20, verse 2, 37, verse 6, and 21, and 38, verse 1. These words are attributed directly to Isaiah. While on the other hand, Isaiah is not named as a source of any of the materials, chapter 40 to 66. So that's why you have these scholars coming up with these different theories and everything. But I feel that the burden of proof is on those who propose these other sources, as no source is maintained, no other source is specified according to Isaiah 40 through 66, and no other source has been found in the archaeological findings. Like at Qumran, these copies of Isaiah 1,000 years older than what we presently have. The Leningrad Codex is what I was thinking. Is that it is a complete copy, right? And it's not. There's not two separate things. So for this study and for all of these studies, we will assume that Isaiah was the author of the entire book of Isaiah, from chapter 1 to chapter 66, all the way through, that God spoke prophetically through him, and God is able to do that. And now, the time span between 739 to 701 BC. Now, in the time frame between 739 and 701 BC, this spans Isaiah chapter 1 through 39. Okay, and Assyria experienced at this point its last period of greatness, and you can see Assyria is up here on the map. I got a map up here on of the Middle East region here, and so it was within this period that Assyria experienced its last greatest greatness, and so this period of greatness ended with the destruction of Assyria by Medo-Babylonia in 609 BC. Now, the Syrian homeland was located in northern Iraq along the Tigris River, and we note this is important as well. Assyria extended its empire southward down the Mesopotamian valley and towards the Mediterranean. So they were going this way, and let's see. So the northern kingdom of Israel, okay, in the northern kingdom, it was ruled by a man named Jeroboam. Now, he was the second Israelite king to bear this name. It wasn't the original Jeroboam. And we read this in 2 Kings chapter 14. Now, the southern kingdom, Judah, also had a single monarch, and this was King Azariah or Uzziah. And we read this in 2 Kings chapter 15 and 2 Chronicles chapter 26. Now, the northern kingdom's relative peace led the people to become complacent in their relationship with God. They served and worshipped other gods. And one of the issues with the Middle Eastern religious practice was that it wasn't as that the people gave up their worship of the God of Israel, Yod He Vav He, right? They added these other gods into the mix, okay, and that was a sin to do. And the prophets Amos and Hosea were sent by God to reprove Israel of their sins and call them to seek God in heaven. And Israel would not listen and continue in their sinful ways, and that led to their destruction. In the southern kingdom, on the other hand, Judah was somewhat less corrupt. Uzziah, however, did not attempt to act as a high priest, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. So he is, however, described as being a faithful king. The sin of Israel is clearly defined according to Hosea, and then in Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 23. We note that Hosea overlaps Isaiah a little bit. Okay, so you get some other prophets that are kind of overlapping Isaiah, and these descriptions of Israel, they were called prostitutes who debased themselves with unworthy lovers for gain or for no gain, and this is synonymous to forgetting God according to Deuteronomy 8 verse 11. The people forsook their trusting in God by serving other gods they had not known. And because of this, the prophets in the rabbinic literature implicitly link idolatry, and oppression together as one. In 735 BC, then Pekah, king of Israel, and Rezin, king of Damascus, mounted an attack against Judah. We read this in 2 Kings chapter 16 and 2 Chronicles chapter 28. And it is possible there was a joint attack from the Edomites and the Philistines as well. We'll read that in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 6, and 2 Chronicles chapter 28, again, verses 16 to 18. Or knowing Judah's military was busy fighting against the kingdoms of the north, maybe they took advantage of that. Because of these things, Ahaz was afraid of the Assyrian Israelite threat, and we read that in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 2. And so he sent to Tiglath-Pileser for help in 2 Kings chapter 16 again. And these events led to the first phase of Isaiah's ministry. Isaiah saw Judah become more involved in politics and power as opposed to trusting in God. So Isaiah speaks of this in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21 to 23, chapter 2, verses 12 to 17. So Assyria, of course, was no friend of Judah, and they would take what Judah gave them and then take more from the nation by force. So eventually, Tiglath-Pileser conquered Pekah and destroyed Damascus in 723 BC. Ajax was called to stand before Tiglath-Pileser and enter into a covenant even more binding, which required recognition of the Assyrian gods. And we read that in 2 Kings chapter 16 and 2 Chronicles chapter 28. So the scriptures consider Hezekiah a good king, one who sought to cleanse the land of idolatry and the temple of pagan worship. King Hezekiah also sought to establish Torah, right, in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 2 Chronicles 29. He also extended the borders of his kingdom in 2 Kings chapter 18. And Hezekiah also called the people of northern Israel to come to a Passover, right? He invited Israel in the north to a Passover according to 2 Chronicles chapter 30. And the idea of inviting Israel to a Passover demonstrates his vision for the nation to return to God, return to Torah, right? And the scholars, they're not certain to what extent Hezekiah was involved in the confederation formed against the Assyrians, from 715 to 713 BC by the Philistines in South Syria area, but we learn that later or earlier on, Sargon II was a successor of Sennacherib. Remember Sennacherib in the scriptures? He was born in 762 BC, and in 710 he was in a position to fight against Babylon, and so started a war campaign against Merodach-Baladan and defeated him. And as a result of this victory, he got world dominance, of that region. He gained a lot of pride from his victory as his enemies lay at his feet. And so he considered himself Dur Sharukan, the mountain of Sargon, right? And believing himself to be very mighty. And this is the man that's being described according to Isaiah chapter 14. So Sargon was killed on the battlefield and disgraced and just forgotten. And so his death led to great joy in the hearts of those who were oppressed by Assyria. And in 710 BC, Babylon came down to Judah in Isaiah chapter 39, and Hezekiah made an alliance with Philistia, Edom, and Moab. And this was his basically playing politics with the nations, and this was an affront to God that had extreme consequences. And Isaiah speaks about this in chapter 22, 29, and chapter 30. So Sennacherib became king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire following the death of his father, Sargon II, right, in 705 BC, and Sennacherib died in 681 BC. And in the third Babylonian campaign, Sennacherib came down the coast of the Mediterranean to Tyre. We don't have that on the map, but Tyre never again, he captured the city, put in a new leader, right, put a new leader on the throne, and then Tyre never again gained its strength and power following this invasion. So Sennacherib then attacked the Philistine cities of Ekron and Ashkelon, and so the Babylonian army began then to move inward to attack the fortresses of Judah that were in the rolling hill country between Philistia and the Philistine plain and the central ridge, such places as the stronghold of Lachish, and we read that in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 13. Hezekiah made an agreement with Egypt, and it's unclear of whether Egypt helped at this time. That weak reed of a king, right? That you remember that the annals of Sennacherib reports that the Egyptian attack took place before the attack on Ekron and Ashkelon. And the speech given by Rabshakeh outside of Jerusalem mentioning Egypt in Isaiah 36. And note, according to Isaiah 37, verse 9, we read that Sennacherib was concerned about a possible Egyptian attack, so he wrote a letter to follow up Rabshakeh's visit. Therefore, the Egyptian battle must have come subsequent to the Rabshakeh's visit and fall of Lachish. Scholars, they disagree about what happens next, but all agree that the Hezekiah paid Sennacherib a very large sum or very large tribute for the Assyrian army to return back home. And then Sennacherib left Jerusalem, which was very uncharacteristic of his modus operandi. He would generally dispose of the existing king and place a compliant king in his place. But he left Hezekiah in place, however. And so the biblical account has God given a plague killing many in the Assyrian army, which forced their retreat. And so that's why Sennacherib left Jerusalem and went back home. And I believe later then he was killed, right, by his own children in the temple that he worshipped in. Now, the biblical account then, it had that plague. Okay, scholars say that this plague was not in the annals of the Assyrians, but we have the biblical accounting of this event, right? And so this account in and of itself proves the wisdom of trusting in God, as opposed to trusting in foreign armies. Nonetheless, the Assyrian officer appeared outside the gates and demanded full capitulation with consequent deportation. Okay, and acting on encouragement from Isaiah, Hezekiah refused to do that. He refused to give in. Now, the time span between 605 and 539. This spans Isaiah chapter 40 through chapter 40 through chapter 66. We note that chapters 40 through 66 do not correspond to specific historical events like those from Isaiah 6 through 39. Now, Isaiah chapter 40 through 66 can be divided into two groups. And the first grouping is chapter 40 through 55, and it seems to offer hope to a people in exile. And the second is chapters 56 to 66. This appears to speak to the people who have returned to the land, back to Israel. So Babylon succeeded Nineveh as the ruling city of the world empire by 605. And I believe that Nineveh was one of the ruling cities of the Assyrians, and that reminds us of Jonah, right? And now, a coalition of Babylonia and Medo-Persia, the Medes being more northern group, and the Persians a more southern group, from the mountainous regions east of Mesopotamia. They combined to topple the Assyrian army or its remains in 609 BC. And at first, the Babylonians were the dominant figures in the alliance, thus they took the richer southern parts of the Assyrian land, while the Medes took the sparser northern parts. And this Neo-Babylonian empire that lasted between 650 to 539 was a brief interlude in a much larger movement, the Medo-Persian one. So these people never intended to be satisfied with the outer edges of the Assyrian spoils, nor did they intend to have a larger portion. They intended to have it all, and thus they only bided their time under the stronger Babylonian monarch Nebuchadnezzar and his progressively weaker successors until they were ready to move in 539 BC. They ushered in what was known as the Persian Empire at 539 BC. So the Judean exile was confined to this time period of Babylonian power. And Babylon continued the Assyrian policy of deportation of the people, where the people were exiled to a distant land where they were less likely to create a rebellion. So this deportation of Judeans occurred prior to 586 in 598 BC, according to 2 Kings chapter 24. With the destruction of Jerusalem, there was another more extensive deportation of the people in 2 Kings chapter 25. And because of this, Isaiah chapter 40 through 55 directly addresses the situation of the loss of faith due to exile. So Isaiah tells the people that God has not abandoned them, but has chosen them. The point is that God is still able to deliver the exiles. He's still able to deliver from sin and bring the people back to the land. And we note that the power of God, as no other nation has ever returned except Israel, right? And God's promise always come true, and we and are eternally trustworthy. God is able to do anything. We see this return from Egypt, right? God bringing a nation from out of the midst of another nation, and then we find this return from Babylon, right? And so Israel's the only nation that has done this. And now, King Cyrus brought in a new foreign policy. He completely reversed the previous policy, granting exiles to return home and offering imperial funds for the rebuilding of the temple. And this was undoubtedly the result of God working in Cyrus's heart, right? We know that in the Torah, God worked in the hearts of godless men or ungodly men. He worked in the hearts of Pharaoh. He worked in the heart of Abimelech, right? And so on. And so undoubtedly, this is the case, that God was working in the heart of King Cyrus. And as a result, he completely reversed the previous policy, granting exiles to return home and offering imperial funds for the rebuilding of the temple, right? In Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And this was undoubtedly the result of God working in his heart. Something to note, that Cyrus giving money for the rebuilding of the temple was consistent with the Middle Eastern belief that these other gods worked in conjunction with the God of Israel. So he was hoping that the Israel God would bless him for the monies that he gave. And the belief was that Marduk, Ashur, Bel, Amun-Ra, and Hashem, right, the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, were all manifestations of the one God. That's what they thought. And this couldn't be further from the truth, as Isaiah states this with a resounding no, according to Isaiah 45, verses 4 through 5. And it says, I have surnamed you, though you knew me not. I am the Lord, and as there is no other besides me, there is no God. I will gird you, though you knew me not, that men may know from the east and from the west that beside me there is none. Okay, so Isaiah is making it clear that there is no other God. Hashem is the only true God, the creator of all that we know. And that the next time span that we look at in the last one here, and this spans the last part of the book of Isaiah, is the time span between 539 and 400 BC. So the exile of Israel extended up until 539 BC. Long after Cyrus's decree, they could return. So zealous Jews such as Zerubbabel and the high priest Jeshua, and we read in Ezra chapter 2 and 3, started this long journey back to Judah and Jerusalem. Now, according to Ezra chapter 2, there was approximately 50,000 people who were invited to return. And so they had this idealized vision of the promised land, which probably fueled the move, right? And we note how once they returned, they were not welcomed with open arms. They were in fact treated with hostility and suspicion. So the work to build the second temple began and then quickly ended. And it wasn't until 20 years later that the work would begin again with the prophet Haggai and Zechariah were able to get the people to consider their faith in the God of Israel to begin the world, Israel again. And in 516 BC, the work was completed. It was no comparison to Solomon's temple, however, and the efforts of these prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, were to a very difficult people. And since 75 years later, when Ezra and Nehemiah came on the scene, it was by their efforts that the national identity returned as the people of God. And at this time, Judah had depended in part on the Persian Empire and functioned as a satrap, a provincial governor. And so the capital of this satrap was possibly located in Damascus, and under the satrap were local governors, as indicated according to Ezra chapter 4, verse 17, where the governor is in Samaria, and Nehemiah 5, verse 15, where Nehemiah is appointed governor of Judah. Taking the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi, is possible to reconstruct the religious life of Judah during this period of time. And in general, three groups can be identified. One was those who were deeply concerned about God and the relationship of Judah to him. Two, those who were concerned about the religion. And three, those who cared little for either. And so this is why we observe the relaxation on intermarriage with the nations, right? And the problems with the temple service according to Ezra 9, Nehemiah 13, and Malachi chapter 1 and 2. Now in Isaiah 56 to 60, it corresponds to the religious complacent asserting that a foreigner or a eunuch who serves God faithfully from the heart is a better Jew than those whose bloodlines are perfect, but whose relationship to God is carried out with a minimum of effort or reflection at best. Another theme which, like the previous one, plays up a contrast is the inability of human beings to bring about the promised salvation, but the complete ability of God through his Spirit to do so. Isaiah 40 through 55 speaks of hope to a people who fear that they are cast off, and Isaiah 56 through 66 is a call for a realized righteousness for a people who have lapsed into a careless dependence upon position. Okay, so the entire book of Isaiah is a call to a return to God, to return to his Torah, a return to faithfulness and to believing in walking in his ways. And so as we study through Isaiah, we will try to look at these things and understand how there is such a great hope in our Creator God, and how there is hope no matter what the circumstance may be, and that the Lord calls us to draw near to him, in his word and in faith, and to live faithfully unto him until the day we die, right? And we go to be with him. Okay, so that's what I had for the introduction for today. And so we will begin next week with Isaiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. And it is good. There's a lot of good stuff. Yeah, I'm enjoying it. And as I continue to work on Isaiah, I can tell that there's a certain way I'm going to format how I write this, going one verse at a time. And the way I wrote verses 1 through 9 and then verses 10 through 20, a little bit different. It's just a little different because I'm kind of getting an idea on how I want to write this, how I want to put all this material together so we can look at it, we can learn, and we can grow in a relationship with God. So that's what I have. And come back next week, and we will have a lot of fun studying the scriptures, okay? Thanks for listening. Bye.